Welcome to day 3 of our winter tree identification workshop. This section is difficult groups and uncommon trees. Monday's session was really the introduction and the basics. We focused on those characteristics that we needed to look at when identifying trees in the winter. Wednesday's session, of course, was common trees of Illinois, and today we're focusing mostly on these difficult groups, the oaks and hickories. And then we'll also touch on a few uncommon trees that we were just unable to squeeze into the day 2. And the handouts for this session and the other 2 previous sessions are on our box folder, at the URL listed here. You can get those, they're PDF slides of all the presentations. And like I said earlier, today's session is difficult groups and uncommon trees. Oaks and hickories are really what we're going to focus on today. We'll try to hit a bunch of those. Again, really focusing on kind of how to tell those close lookalikes apart. We'll finish those up and then hit about 4 or 5 less common trees just to kind of finish out our list. And overall, I think we're going to end up trying to cover right around 20 species in total. So our oaks, this is a big group in Illinois. We actually have 20 different species that are native to Illinois, 21 if you consider dwarf chestnut oak a native species here. And they're split into 2 groups. There's the red oaks and the white oaks. These are both still in the same genus, that Quercus genus, but they are functionally and biologically and ecologically really different. They have some characteristics that separate them. You can see we have 12 red oak species and 8 white oak species. The ones highlighted here are the ones I'm actually going to focus on for this presentation. So I'll cover 4 different red oaks and 5 different white oaks, group of species in that white oak group. But oaks in general, you can tell them just because they tend to have the buds clustered towards the tip of the twig. And that's true for whites and reds. So if you see that where you have a cluster of buds, you see the terminal buds here at the end, and then a lot of these lateral buds just clustered around them. That's a good characteristic to focus on when you're looking at, is this an oak? Is the tree you're looking at an oak? If it has that on there's twigs, there's a good chance that you're looking at an oak. So how to tell red and white oaks? You can tell a little bit by the twigs, although that's a somewhat variable. In general, white oaks will have more rounded twigs, buds on the twigs, and in general, red oaks will have more pointed, but it's not as consistent. So really the way I tell those 2 groups apart in general is by the bark. So red oaks as a group typically have dark gray to sometimes blackish bark. It'll be darker than the white oaks. The bark in general is tighter bark and usually strongly ridge and furrowed, can be somewhat blocky or smooth. White oaks, in contrast, usually have a lighter gray or almost silvery bark or a whitish color bark. They can be ridge and furrowed to actually oftentimes platy bark, especially with white oak, the white oak species itself. And you can see here in this picture, I love this picture. It was taken a couple years ago up on Atwood Ridge here in southern Illinois. But it's a black oak, which is a member of the red oak group on the right, and a true white oak there on the left. And they've kind of grew up next to each other so close they fuse together. It really shows the differences between the two groups here, where on the left you can see that white oak is a real light colored, almost white silver. And you can see that the bark is kind of flaky or platy, I guess you would say. And on the right, that black oak is very, very dark gray, almost black bark, strongly ridge and furrowed. So once you see these enough, and there is definitely variation between the species, but it becomes easier and easier to, in general, lock it into one group or another just from bark characteristics. And so here on the left, you can see those 2 big trees in the foreground. Those are 2 big white oaks. Still somewhat blocky bark, but still that light color, that silvery color really stands out. And then on the right, the picture on the right, the tree in the foreground is another white oak, but in the background, you can see that darker colored stem back there. That's looking at one of the red oaks. Here are just a couple different pictures of different red oaks. The one on the left is actually a northern red oak, and the one on the right is black oak. But you can see here, they both kind of have that dark gray. The black oak itself is thicker, more ridge and furrowed bark. The northern red oak on the left there is still darker gray, tight bark, but it has those kind of silvery sheen to it a little bit as well. So there's definitely some variation, but overall it's a much darker color than what you expect from the white oaks. So I'm going to start just with 3 species. These are 3 that are hard to tell apart sometimes, especially in the winter. People mistake them for each other. They often grow together and in the same forest. But white oaks, true white oaks, post oaks, and Chinkapin oaks, all 3, I've kind of lumped them as our upland white oaks. Again, these are 3 that have similar bark, similar characteristics overall. So I wanted to focus on them really to show people kind of how to tell these 3 species apart from each other. And I'll do that for the rest. You'll see it again and again. I'll highlight and kind of compare similar species. But we're going to start with the white oak, the true white oak, Quercus alba. This is a tree common, found in every county in the state for sure. Like all oaks, it has alternate buds, alternate branching as well. The buds on this one are small, rounded, and reddish. So small reddish buds, somewhat pointed, but overall it's got a kind of a bluntly pointed or rounded appearance to it. The scales on them are smooth, really hairless. The twigs themselves also are slender for an oak, at least compared to the others. Reddish and smooth overall as well. Again, you can see those clustered buds on there. I will say that identifying oaks in general just by the buds can be very difficult. I think there's a lot of variation in them, and I don't in general go on bud characteristics or twig characteristics alone to identify oaks. I really like to combine that with bark identification or habitat or some other things, really to nail it down. So going just by the twigs alone sometimes can get you in trouble. Looking at the bark of white oak, it is light gray, almost a silvery color to it, a light color, light silver. It's actually highly variable in texture. There's a lot of different characteristics of white oak. It's very variable in terms of what it looks like. Oftentimes it could be a tight, ridged and furrowed or almost blocky bark like you see on the right hand picture there. Or it can be really, really platy, and so it has these kind of peeling loose plates. In general, what I've seen with white oak is that they get that platiness and that peeling bark like that with age. And so you'll see the upper half of the tree of larger trees will look more like that. And if you get to the lower half of those larger trees, they're going to be more blocky or strongly ridged and furrowed. And then the younger trees are going to be usually more of that ridge and furrow look like it, or tighter blocky bark. Again, very variable. Really what jumps out to you with white oak is that coloration. That light gray, almost white coloration jumps out to you as it being a white oak. These can be very large trees. When they're grown in a forest, they're often tall, clear trunks, which means that it's a long way up till you get to the first limbs, and narrow crowns in a forest grown setting, like the picture on the right there, a beautiful big white oak. They can also grow in more open grown conditions. In that case, they're going to be more of an open spreading canopy to those trees with shorter trunks, meaning that the side branches are lower down. So it really depends on the conditions they grow in. You see them both ways. White oak's fairly a habitat generalist. Overall, you'll find it mostly in these rich, well-drained upland soils, fairly nutrient high sites, but it can be in drier sites or poorer sites as well, even slightly wetter sites. It doesn't like its feet wet. You don't see it in the real wet conditions. Now, post oak, a little different. It's found in the southern third or southern 2/3 of the state, maybe southern half of the state. But again, I see a lot of people mistaking these two. Looking at the twig, the differences is post oak buds are much more strongly rounded. So they're not, they don't have that kind of bluntly point. They're typically a little more rounded, it's more spherical, and then they're typically covered in tiny hairs. So they're somewhat fuzzy, the buds are. The twigs are usually stouter in post oak, and you can see that on the lower left picture. So thicker twigs, it's usually gray in color, and they are often slightly fuzzy. So if you look at the twigs, you can really see that on the picture on the right. It's not a smooth picture. It's not a smooth twig at all. There's going to be some slight fuzz on them. So comparing that to white oak, thicker twig, more rounded buds, and more fuzz on it. Post oak bark can sometimes be difficult, but in general, it's a tighter bark. It's strongly ridged and furrowed. It could be moderately thick, light gray in color, but it doesn't have that almost white sheen that you see with white oaks. The way I pick out post oak is often they're broken into these real clear rectangular sections. So it's not true blocky. They're very clear ridges and furrows, but the ridges are broken into these really, really square or rectangular looking little sections. It really reminds me of that old real tree camo pattern from the 80s. It just really jumps out. So it's real clear. You see that those rectangular shapes to me really jump out and make it clear that it's post oak. Often post oak has patchy bark, so it'll have that thicker bark with those rectangular sections, and then in places it'll have smooth sections as well. And that's true with a lot of trees, but it really does seem to occur a lot in post oak. They tend to be a medium-sized tree. They don't really get nearly as big as white oaks tend to get. And they usually don't have a very clear, tall trunk. Often it's a thick, stout trunk, but it's short. And so you get a lot of the branching lower down to the ground. And they often have a very, very clearly rounded canopy. So they're almost as wide or wider than they are tall many times. Post oaks generally grow in poor quality conditions. You'll see these in drier uplands, poor soil areas, or down in flatwood communities, which usually have heavy clay. They dry out, but they also have standing water at some times. So they seem to tolerate these poor growing conditions better than some of the other oaks. I will say that, but you do see them growing right next to white oaks at times too, just co-occurring in the same conditions. But you're looking for that broad, rounded shape to the canopy, and then those characteristics of the bark and the twigs we talked about. Now, the third in this group, Chinkapin oak, looks a little different again, but as for the upland white oaks, this one has the most pointed buds. So they're rounded or angular, but if you cut them in cross section, they'll strongly be angular. They're more pointed than any of the other two. So post or white oak, they're going to be more pointed. The margins of the scales are going to be slightly hairy, and you can see that in the pictures where it kind of shows up at those white lines. The twigs are slender, much thinner than post oak, gray, maybe to orange, brown, or reddish, but they're going to be smooth as well. I will say in general, if all you have are twigs, it's very difficult to tell oaks apart. I don't find them consistent enough to get to species just from having the twigs. You want to look at some other characteristics, but they do help. Chinkapin oak, its bark is going to look a lot like a white oak, and you see a lot of people mistake Chinkapin oak for white oak because they do co-occur at times and their bark looks a lot alike. It's that same light gray or silver, almost white looking bark. The difference is it tends to be a lot less thick. You don't have that really thick, those hard plates. When it does flake, it tends to be thinner and almost kind of becomes scaly or peeling a little bit. And that's the one way that you can really pick out the difference in the bark. If you see them together, the same size tree, Chinkapin, the bark just doesn't look that thick. It looks like you could rub your hand against it and a lot of those flakes will just break right off, versus a white oak, which would have thicker bark, kind of stronger, harder bark. Takes a while. Again, sometimes that's hard to see, but if you see them right beside each other, you can start to see the differences. Chinkapin is a large size tree. Forest grown trees are tall. Tall trees, narrow crowns. They can be open grown with spreading canopy as well. The main thing with Chinkapin oak is it tends to strongly prefer calcareous upland soils. So soils that are developed over limestone, they have a higher pH. That's where you'll usually see Chinkapin. If you're in areas over a lot of sandstone, or areas that have acidic soils, you tend not to find Chinkapin oak in those situations. So that's another good thing. If you're in an area with a lot of limestone, that's where you would expect to find Chinkapin. Those three trees, white oak, post oak, and Chinkapin oak, they can grow right next to each other. Here at the Dixon Springs Ag Center, we have some areas that have sinkholes, and we have some limestone in here, and we found all three of them growing right in the same woods, right next to each other. So habitat's important, but it's not the only thing you can use to separate those. Bark is a big one. So again, white oak, your bark is light gray to silver, forming loose plates. Post oak is light gray, but it tends to be darker than the others. And you have those tighter ridges that have rectangular sections. And then Chinkapin oak is going to be the thinnest of the barks. It's light gray and silver, but usually it's scaly or peeling bark to it. And you can see on the top there the differences in the buds as well. Whereas post oak tends to have a rounded bud, Chinkapin is a little more pointed, and white oak's somewhere in the middle. Those three can be hard to tell apart, I will tell you. So the more you look at them in the summer where you have the leaves, when it's easy to identify them, and get used to looking at the differences in bark, the differences in the thickness of the twigs, and then you'll start to be able to identify those. Something that helps, again, looking at the ground below the trees to see what the leaves will tell you. There's nothing wrong with that. It's kind of using that as part of your tool chest here. Alrighty, jumping into our Upland Red Oaks. So I have 4 I'm going to talk about that are fairly common across the state. Northern Red Oak and Black Oak, those two can be very difficult to tell apart if you're not familiar with what characteristics to look for. Shingle Oak is another common Upland Red Oak, and then Pin Oak. And I do have an asterisk here by Pin Oak, and before anybody asks about it, that is actually intentional this time, unlike the other presentations. The reason I put that on there is Pin Oak is not really an upland oak. You mostly see those in the bottomlands, but they are planted widely across the state, including in the uplands. So I wanted to add that here to this. Just understand that it's not typically considered an upland oak. But jumping in, Northern Red Oak, another one of the most common trees across the state. This one is, in terms of the twigs and the buds are reddish brown, much more strongly pointed in these red oaks than we saw in the white oaks. Smooth and hairless. The twigs are moderate in size, so they're not stout or very slender. They're just kind of middle of the road, reddish brown and smooth. I find that the red oaks in general are extremely difficult to identify just on the twigs, with a few exceptions. So use them, but understand that twigs alone, to me, are often not enough to get it to species. Now the bark is what you're looking for when you want to identify Northern Red Oak. To me, that's really what stands out in terms of the characteristics. The bark of Northern Red Oak tends to be dark gray, but it has these shiny silver, I call them ski trails. They're basically the flattened ridges on this ridge and furrow bark. It's very shallowy ridge and furrow bark. And then the ridges are going to be more shiny, kind of a dark silver in color, and then they're really run the length of the tree. So they look like these long, shiny ski trails, if you will, up and down the tree. And that occurs even on the larger individuals. You'll see some of that at the base, but as you look up, it really stands out to you. You can see that on the picture on the left there. And the picture on the right is a little bit of a larger tree, and it still very clearly shows the ski trails. Another thing you can look for is the inner bark. And so this is another reason to carry a pocket knife with you when you're going to identify trees. If you're unsure, you can actually take and bore a little tiny hole, kind of pick one of the fissures where the bark's thin anyway, and then expose some of that inner bark. And you can see that in the picture in the middle. The inner bark of northern red oak tends to be a light pink or really light reddish in color. You can see that here in this picture. That's a important characteristic, so keep that in mind as we move on. But that's a good way to kind of check that you're looking at northern red oak, is dig in there and see what that inner bark color is. Northern red oak is a medium to a large tree. It often has a clear, tall tree with a clear trunk, relatively small canopy. You can look up into the tree and you can see those noticeable ski trails really on any size of a tree, and even the larger ones. So to me, that's the most important characteristic for picking this one out. The other thing is this is probably the oak, the red oak that grows in some of the higher productivity sites. So you'll see this one in rich woods, coves, north slopes, productive upland sites. Sites that have better soils, you'll tend to see northern red oak as compared to some of the other upland red oaks that we have around. Now, black oak is the one that's probably most commonly confused with northern red oak. The leaves look very similar, even in the summer. The trees themselves look very similar, even in the winter. If you can get to the buds are pointed gray to reddish and brown and orange in color. Often they're covered in minute hairs, and so that's one of the differences there between it and northern red oak. The same thing with the twigs. The twigs can be, especially when they're twigs on young trees, kind of covered in these orange hairs as well and hairy. Older twigs or twigs on older individuals will be a little smooth, but if you find that those hairy twigs with those orange looking buds, that really points you towards black oak. Now, black oak bark is really where you're going to separate it from northern red oak. Black oak bark is very, very dark, and hence the name. It's almost black in color. And its ridges are not these long, flat ridges. Its bark tends to be much thicker than northern red oak. You don't really have those ski trails. If they are, and if they are there, they're kind of only at the top part of the tree. But usually you have these kind of broken, blocky ridges that are fairly thick in thickness. So they really stand out that way. And the picture on the right is kind of a classic black oak bark. But even when they're young, you see on the picture on the left there, that very young black oak, it's still showing that blocky characteristic to it. As you can see that it's going to get some thick bark. And then, unlike the northern red oak, if you dig in with your pocket knife and look at the inner bark of black oak, it's going to have a bright orange coloration. You can see that with that middle picture. That's a great way to verify your identification if you're unsure, is take a look at the inner bark and see if it's light pink, so northern red, or orange, like this one here with black oak. Black oak is a medium to large tree. They can get pretty big, but they tend to be somewhat shorter lived than some of the other oaks, usually 100 to 125 years, and then you'll see them start to kind of fall apart. They tend to have tall, clear trunks, usually if they're on a good site, or they can grow as a crooked, limby tree on poor sites or open grown areas. And they have a bit of a wide habitat suitability, but you find them most often dry ridges, upper slopes, south and west facing aspects. So some of those poor conditions than you would find, poorer, drier conditions than you would find northern red oak. It can also occur on some of the savannas, particularly in northern Illinois. So that's where you would have these shorter trees, more wide spreading trees like that. But again, with these two, which a lot of people mistake for each other, the northern red and the black oak, you're looking at the bark. So you want to see, is the bark kind of blocky and dark, or is it tighter with these silvery, shiny ski trails? And then you want to look at the color of the inner bark. So in these pictures, on the left, we have northern red oak, and then on the top is the northern red oak inner bark. On the right is black oak, and in the bottom is black oak inner bark. Once you see that a lot, you can tell them apart, but it can be difficult. Pin oak. Pin oak's, again, super common in terms, especially planted around. You see it widely planted in people's yards, even some big ones. They've been planted for a long time. Their buds are also sharply pointed, reddish brown and smooth. The twigs tend to be more slender on this one than some of the other species, brown and smooth as well. And what I've found is pin oak tends to hold its leaves more so than a lot of the other oak species. And oftentimes, if you look at their twigs, you either have leaves themselves or you'll have the petioles of the leaves. And that's what we're seeing here, where there's the leaves have broken and fallen off, but the petioles kind of remain stuck. So you can't even see the leaf scars because they're covered by these, what's left of the leaf that never did really fall off. And I see that really consistently with pin oaks in the winter, is that you'll find a lot of these broken petioles on the twigs. Pin oak tends to have some of the thinnest and tightest bark of any of the other oaks. If it is ridge and furrowed, it's going to be lightly furrowed, thin bark, broad ridges as well. It almost looks like a smooth bark. And that really, to me, jumps out to you when you're looking at the bark. Pin oak can be a medium to a large tree, pyramidal in shape, especially when it's young, with a fairly thin canopy. To me, what really stands out with pin oak is that the branches that come off, the lateral branches that branch out from the main trunk, tend to be very, very thin. So small diameter, thin branches. They often come out at nearly right angles, especially at the lower part of the tree. Oftentimes the lower branches even droop and kind of point back to the ground, and you can see that with that central picture. And even if they die and like the lower branches get self-shaded, they often stay on there. So a lot of times you'll have a lot of little dead branches sticking out from the main trunk on a pin oak. And that really, really is a common characteristic, and it's a way of kind of picking out a pin oak even from a distance. As you see those small branches lower to the ground that are pointing down at the ends and kind of hanging on to the tree even after they're dead. So that, to me, pin oak's one of the easier ones to identify by the form, just seeing it from a distance, kind of because of that tendency to have those droopy lower branches. Another one that sometimes gets mistaken for pin oak is shingle oak. Its buds or its twigs are very similar to pin oak. Sharply pointed reddish brown buds. They may be slightly hairy, slender twigs, reddish brown and smooth. The bark is similar to pin oak as well. It tends to be a little thicker and a little bit more broken apart. So you have broad ridges, shallow furrows like pin oak, but it tends to be a little bit more thicker. It can be somewhat variable, but you still look for kind of overall somewhat of a shallow bark for this one, dark gray in color, a little more variable as well. It tends to be a medium-sized tree that's often a poor form tree. So shingle oak is often very limby, not clear trunks, not a well-developed canopy. The limbs often droop on shingle oak, and it often holds its leaves, at least some leaves, well throughout winter. And this one and pin oak too, both had a tendency to have a lot of horned or gouty oak galls, those woody galls that are on the smaller stems, all over the canopy. So if you see a lot of horned oak galls or gouty oak galls, those small or those rounded woody galls that are growing on the small branches, that's another good indication that it might be a shingle or a pin oak as well. But really, to kind of tell them apart from pin oak, they tend to have slightly thinner bark or thicker bark. Shingle oak does. It doesn't have nearly this much of that pyramidal shape. And even though its branches droop, the branches tend to be bigger. They don't have those really thin branches like pin oak does. And then especially if you have the leaves, it's one of our only oaks in Illinois that doesn't have lobed leaves. That's another good way to pick it out if it holds its leaves into winter. So the last two oaks that I'm going to hit, I didn't know how to categorize them, so I have this funny category of stout-twigged, thick-barked white oaks. That's kind of a weird category, but Bur Oak and swamp white oak is often misidentified with each other. They actually can hybridize fairly readily with each other because they're somewhat closely related, and they do look a lot alike. So if you're unfamiliar with these and you don't have the acorns or the leaves to look at, it can be difficult at times to identify, to separate these two species. We'll start with Bur Oak. Bur Oak, a lot of people are familiar with these from a distance, but if you get up close, their buds are kind of bluntly pointed. They can be covered in gray fuzz, but they're going to have a fairly stout twig, especially compared to most of the other oaks. These twigs are going to be kind of thick and heavy, even heavier than post oak. And you can see that on the picture on the bottom left. Those branches, they just look kind of thick and stubby. The twigs may also develop some corky ridges on them, so the twigs will even look thicker, especially the parts of the branches that are 2 to 3 years old. They may be thick and corky looking, and that really makes it look thick and makes it stand out. In terms of bark, it's going to be one of the darker barks of the white oaks, so almost a dark gray brown, very, very thick usually, with deep furrows and high ridges, thick ridges, and they really run a long way. So you see these deep furrowed, thick ridged, really thick, heavy bark is a good way to describe Bur Oak bark. Smaller branches, like I said earlier, you see on the bottom left there, often have those kind of corky ridges on them, so that makes them look thick. But really, you're looking for that. It almost doesn't look like an oak bark compared to the others. Long vertical ridges that are very thick with deep furrows in it will get you at Bur Oak. This can be a very large tree. Even though it's a large tree, it often has a short trunk. Have a short trunk, big side branches, thick spreading side branches, and that gives it overall a very large, rounded canopy. The one I took a picture of is not in good health, as you can see, so it doesn't really show that rounded canopy as well. But overall, they tend to have that. This is actually one that grows in a range of habitats. Most of us are used to seeing Bur Oaks up in the uplands, kind of spreading out in a savanna or at the edge of a prairie or something like that. And we certainly do have a ton of those like that. But Bur Oak also grows in riparian areas, on stream sides, low areas that are fairly wet. We see Bur Oak in that habitat as well. So it can kind of grow in both of those conditions. Now we'll contrast that with swamp white oak. Again, swamp white oak is one that I think is commonly misidentified with Bur Oak or confused with Bur Oak. So the main thing is it also has very stout twigs, but instead of having that corky, thick bark on some of their twigs, you'll usually have flaky or thin peeling bark. And we see that with the middle picture there. And that's one of the best ways to tell them apart is look at the twigs and find out if they're peeling or corky. So swamp white oak on their younger twigs will often have that peeling nature. Now, the larger trees on swamp white oak tend to look a lot like Bur Oak. As it gets larger, you'll have those thick bark with those long vertical ridges. And I definitely want to thank Cypress Creek National Wildlife Refuge for helping me find some swamp white oaks to photograph for this presentation. It took all the way up to halfway through this week. I was worried that I would not have the pictures I needed, but they came through and helped me find some. So yeah, the larger individuals, they look very, very similar in bark to Bur Oak. Thick vertical ridges, deep furrows, but the younger stems, the younger individuals or the smaller branches, you get that flaky or peeling nature to them, thinner bark that peels, and it really stands out as different than Bur Oak. To me, that's the way to tell them apart, is the medium to small size branches and twigs and what the bark looks like. If it's thick and corky, you're looking at Bur Oak. If it's thinner and flaking and peeling, then you're going to be looking at swamp white oak. Now this can be a very large tree, broad rounded canopy, thick short trunk, low lateral branches, all of that. It's named well, as you can see in the picture here, especially the one on the right, growing right in a swamp. But it does also grow in the uplands. And so that's a little bit confusing sometimes, because you expect it to be only in the lowlands and only growing in the swamps. But it can grow in a bit wider of a habitat conditions than just the low areas. It will often retain its leaves well into winter. And that to me is a good characteristic as well, because the leaves of swamp white oak are usually bright white on the underside, and even as the leaves dry down and turn brown in the winter and they're hanging on the tree, that bright white underside really is noticeable. And you can see that on the picture on the lower left here with those bright white leaves. And so if you have leaves on it, that really kind of jumps out to me even from a distance. And so with these two, Bur Oak and swamp white oak, again, the thickness and the corkiness of the twigs jump out. Bur Oak has thick, corky bark. White oak has thin, kind of peeling, flaky bark on those smaller limbs and twigs. To me, that's the difference between the two to pick them apart. Alrighty, let's do a quick knowledge check. So we have a picture here of an oak, right? I'm not going to say what oak it is, but I'm going to open a poll up here and tell me, do you think this is a white oak or a red oak? Which group are we looking at here? So I'll give you all a minute here to put your answers in. Happy to see so many people answering it. So remember, we're looking at color, texture, all of that kind of falls into this. Sometimes it can be difficult, for sure. So sometimes it can be harder to tell them apart, just even by the bark, but just answer what you think it is. And I'll give you all about another 5 seconds. All righty, I'm going to go ahead and end the polling and share it. And I'm happy to say that most people got it right. So 80% of y'all thought it was a red oak, and that is correct. Sometimes they can be difficult, so I'm definitely not going to chastise anybody for thinking it could be a white oak as well, because there's a lot of variation in there. But this is actually a black oak, which is one of our red oak groups. All right, let's move on to the hickories. Hickories as a group are some of the most difficult to tell apart. It says 20 species. I'm sorry, there's 10 species in Illinois. I did not change that. But they can be broadly into 2 different groups. So they're true hickories. And so there's 7 of those. And so true hickories will be the ones that in general have smaller leaflet numbers and have rounded fruit that are not winged. But in the winter, what you're looking for here they have imbricate buds. So those are the buds with scales that overlap each other. You can see that on the picture on the left. And that's different than our pecan hickories. So pecan hickories, we have 3 of those in Illinois. Their buds are those valvate buds. They have non-overlapping scales. You can see in the picture there of a pecan bud there. And they really, if you look at them, they look quite a bit different. They also tend to have very higher leaflet numbers for their leaves, and their fruit are usually winged. And so that stands out as well. We're going to cover 6 different hickories, the 6 of the more common hickories that's found across the state, and how to identify them. So I'm going to start here just highlighting that we have a quick 1-page quick reference chart for our hickories and kind of what are characteristics that are used to tell them apart. So this is available on our Extension Forestry website if you want to use it as just a quick reference sheet to kind of tell them apart. But I'm just going to pull out here the characteristics that we're going to use in the winter for the 6 species that we're looking at today. So we have, broadly speaking, we can separate them in terms of the stoutness of their twigs. So we have 3 stout-twigged species and 3 thin-twigged species. And so if you have a stout twig with shaggy bark, you're looking at shagbark or shellbark. A stout twig with tight bark, you're looking at mockernut. And then a thin twig with a valvate bud, you're looking at bitternut. And thin twigs with those overlapping scales and an imbricate bud, you're looking at pignut or red. Right? So that's just broadly, we're going to cover each of these species now alone, but just kind of showing you, you're looking at the bark and the twig, and you can really break these apart fairly quickly. So the first is our shagbark, one of the most common trees across the state, and usually one of the easiest to identify because of the big shaggy bark, right? But when they're young, sometimes their bark isn't shaggy. And so you're looking at their twigs are very stout twigs, and their terminal buds are very large and elongated. So they have long terminal buds, but they're usually not any bigger around than the twig itself, right? So large, long terminal buds that are hairy, and those scales often break off kind of easily. The scales on the bud will. Twigs are very stout, dark in color, and hairy as well. And so that's the main characteristic you can see on this twig here, the hairiness of it and just kind of how thick it is and that really big bud. Shagbark bark, as most of us are familiar with, kind of those interlacing loose strips. It's diamond pattern on young stems, but as it gets older, it gets this real shaggy appearance where there's long strips that'll peel at the bottom or the top and kind of pull away from the tree. Really recognizable. Shagbark is a medium to a large tree, usually tall, straight trunks on forest-grown individuals, but maybe shorter and spreading on open-grown individuals. This is a species that has broad habitat suitability. You'll find it everywhere from rich bottomlands to very, very dry uplands. It kind of occurs kind of across the whole landscape that way. And you can see I snuck another picture of my boy in there beside the state champion. Now we'll contrast that with Shellbark Hickory. Now these are the two that are often very, very difficult to tell apart, especially in those bottomland habitats where they both grow together. It also has large, elongated buds with overlapping loose scales. The buds are slightly hairy or not hairy at all for Shellbark Hickory. Very stout twigs, a little bit lighter in color than Shagbark, but the main difference here is that the twigs of Shellbark Hickory are essentially hairless. So they do look a lot alike, but if you have no hairs on the twigs, it's going to be a shellbark. And if it's a hairy twig, then you're probably looking at shagbark. Those are the kind of the ways to tell those apart just by the twigs. The bark looks very, very similar. You hear a lot of people say that they can tell them apart by the bark, and how shellbark tends to have almost more of a platy bark. I've looked at a ton of these and verified them by the twigs or the fruit. And I say that it's very difficult to tell them apart by the bark alone. I think there's a lot of overlapping characteristics. I don't think that's a good characteristic to separate them. You want to look at the twigs or some other characteristic to verify. This is a large tree, tall, straight trunk, small canopy, and they grow in rich bottomlands. That's where you'll find this one. It doesn't like the uplands at all. So to tell them apart, right, is the twigs. Hairy versus smooth is your big way to tell those two apart in the winter. Now the third of our stout-twigged hickories is Mockernut Hickory. It has very stout, probably the stoutest of all the twigs, but it has this terminal bud is large, but it's rounded. And you can see here, it kind of swells. It's bigger than the twig itself. So very clearly rounded and not that elongated bud like the others. The buds here are going to be light tan in color and fuzzy. You're going to have a lot of kind of dense fuzzy covering on the buds. The same thing for those twigs, reddish brown twigs, stout, but covered in dense hairs. And that's really what gets you for this Mockernut hickory when you're looking at the twigs. Those rounded, big buds, and then the twigs are covered in the hairs. So that's the best way to tell them apart from the rest of the hickories when you're just looking at the twigs. This is probably the tightest bark of, almost the tightest bark of the hickories in terms of there's almost usually no flaking whatsoever, thin bark, tight bark for Mockernut hickory, clear diamond pattern to it. So it doesn't scale, doesn't flake at all. Mockernut is a medium-sized tree. You can see in the picture on the right, we have a pignut we'll talk about in a second on the left, and on the right is a mockernut. And you can see that the bark is just tight. It doesn't look as thick on it. Usually a thin canopy, stout lateral branches, tight bark, thick twigs jump out to you. And this is going to be in dry uplands or mesic forest as well. Common tree, a lot of times it just get overlooked because people just can't separate it from the other hickories. We're going to move into our thin barked hickories next. Thin twigged hickories. Pignut hickory, another super common hickory found across the state. Its terminal bud is also rounded, tan in color, but it's not very large. So it's not that huge bud like we saw with the Mockernut hickory. It does have loose scales that'll flake off on the twigs, on the terminal bud in the winter. The twig overall is moderately thin, so it's much thinner than some of the other hickories, and smooth, so it doesn't have really any hairs on those twigs at all. Its bark is also tight, hard bark, so it's very hard bark. You can't sink your thumbnails into it, but very tight bark and a noticeable diamond pattern to it. The tight bark that doesn't flake is important when we get talking how to tell it apart from red hickory, which is next. This is a medium-sized tree with a narrow canopy that likes dry to mesic upland woods. I put a picture of the ground there that often I'll look at the ground at hickory nuts. That's another way of kind of verifying the ID for these. But red hickory is one that can be very, very difficult to tell apart from pignut hickory. Its terminal buds are rounded as well. It has thin twigs, dark brown in color, hairless. I would say that just on the twigs alone, it's going to be very, very difficult to tell these two apart. Where you tell red hickory from pignut hickory apart is going to be the bark. The bark is dark gray and hard, a diamond pattern, just like pignut hickory, but it tends to become scaly or almost flaking a little bit with age. You can see that the pictures earlier for pignut had very, very tight bark. There was no peeling back or no flaking whatsoever. You can see on this red hickory, dark bark, but very, very thick bark here, even starting to kind of flake or shag a little bit here, and then much more noticeable on the picture on the right. And so kind of everything else being equal in the winter, thin twigs, rounded buds, the flakiness of the bark, the thickness of the bark is going to separate the red hickory from your pignut hickory. This one tends to grow in more drier conditions, although they co-occur. Pignut, shagbark, mockernut, and red hickory grow together. We've got them all in the same acre here at the Ag Center. They grow right next to each other. So you see those kind of mixed in together all the time. So the last of the hickories, when you've got the twigs, is the easiest one to identify, I think so, and that's Bitternut hickory. Super common, found all the way across the state. Its twigs look so much different than really any other tree. Very, very thin twigs, but you're looking at those buds, valvate buds, sulfur yellow in color. Look how colorful that is, and the sulfury yellowness to it really jumps out to me that there's nothing else like it. So Bitternut hickory, to me, by the twigs alone, are the easiest ones to identify. Its bark is very similar in some ways to pignut, where it's a tight bark. It tends to be a little lighter in color, very shallow ridges, very diamond pattern as well. But that tight bark doesn't really flake at all. to it is what you'll get with bitternut. This is a medium-sized tree. It tends to be tall, straight trunks, narrow canopies. It has a wide habitat suitability, all the way from the bottomlands to drier uplands. Very common on the landscape. You see them everywhere. Snuck another picture of my boy in here beside a very large bitternut hickory, but you'll notice he has a pair of binoculars. Binoculars are very, very handy for identifying trees in the winter. This tree was so large that we could not see its buds. Obviously, it was way up in the canopy. So we had a couple options to us. We could dig around and try to find some of the fruit. And so bitternut fruit has those wingings on them like you see in the bottom left. Or we could use those binoculars, look up into the tree and try to see the buds. And with those sulfur yellow buds, they just stood out, kind of glowing in the sun. And it was so easy to identify this tree in the winter with a pair of binoculars. Alrighty, let's do a quick knowledge check. So which hickory is this? We have large rounded buds and stout, densely hairy twigs. Let me pop up our hickory pole here. And so I'll let you all guess which one that we're looking at here. And it's fine if you don't get it right. We covered them in very, very quick succession. But large rounded buds, stout, densely hairy twigs. Hickories are something that takes a long time to get a handle on, and I don't mind telling you all that many foresters will just do hickory species, which when they're identifying hickories, or they just go by and say, oh, it's just a hickory. But it took me last year or 2 years ago, I spent a long time in the summer looking at all the 10 different species and all these different characteristics, photographing them, everything like that, until I was really comfortable identifying them all together. All right, looks like everybody has identified it. And so let's end the polling. Share it. As we can see, most everybody, about half of you, got Mockernut Hickory, and that's great. Shagbark Hickory is also stout-twigged and hairy, but they have more of an elongated bud. So yeah, I'm glad to see people got that. Alrighty, so we are getting close here to, we got 5 minutes left. I've got a handful of uncommon trees that I want to cover next. We'll probably end up going 5, 6, 7 minutes over. I'll go ahead and tell you that. But let's go ahead and kind of cover these uncommon or less common trees that you'll see on the landscape. The first is persimmon, which is kind of a misnomer because it's pretty darn common where it grows, but I wanted to add it in here. Persimmon is one of my favorite trees, really easy to identify in the winter. But by the twigs, you're looking at an alternate twigs, so alternating one bud at a time. The buds on persimmon are small, dark brown or almost black in color, and triangular in shape, and they usually sit fairly tight to the twigs. And then if you look underneath of those buds, they have kind of a smiley face leaf scar. The twigs are moderately slender and hairless. But really for that one, those dark brown or almost black triangular buds are what you're looking for in the twigs for persimmon. But really for persimmon, what you're looking for easy identification is the bark. So the bark is dark brown, almost black in color, very thick, very blocky in bark. So these blocky looking bark. With a thick bark, often you can see the inner bark exposed down in the fissures or in between the blocks, and it's going to have that orange inner bark. Hold on one second, my phone's going off. There we go. So you're looking for that orange inner bark. Smaller stems are smooth in color, and you'll see a lot of orange lenticels. And you can see that here on the left, that smooth bark with the orange lenticels. As it ages or gets larger, you'll get thicker and thicker bark, but the orange coloration on the inner bark stands out. And then when it's large, that dark blocky color to it. It really stands out like nothing else to me. That really jumps out as a neat characteristic that you can identify this one even at 60 miles an hour. In general, it's a medium or almost small tree, though some can get large. Usually it's a poor form tree with some crooked growth, especially the side branches are very crooked, and it jumps out to me. So you see the picture on the right there with that crooked growth of those side branches, and the dark coloration really jumps out. You can identify this one fairly easy like that. This is another one of those fence row trees, like I talked about a little bit on Wednesday, that you'll see this super common growing in fence rows, forest edges, even lake edges, places like that. It loves that kind of edge habitat. The next fairly uncommon tree is Ohio Buckeye. There's several Buckeyes. This is the most common one by far that we have in the state and the most widespread. But this one has very, very large terminal buds. The other thing is it's opposite. So this is another one of those opposite ones like maples and ash, dogwoods, but very, very large terminal buds, strongly pointed terminal buds. If you look at the scales themselves on the buds, usually they're somewhat ridged and it stands out here. You can see one right there, one right there. In that central picture, you can see the ridging. The leaf scars are large on this as well, and there's 3 noticeable bundle scars in each of the leaf scars. And then these twigs are extremely stout, very thick, stout twigs, tan, smooth, hairless twigs. Those really, really big buds and thick, thick twigs jump out, make this really easy to identify even at a young stage. The bark is tight, smooth, light gray or light brown in color. It's often soft and spongy, so you can kind of stick your thumbnail into it. They may develop a shallow diamond pattern to the bark as well. As it gets older, you may get some thin, rounded plates that form on it as well. But overall, it's going to be tight, fairly smooth, soft bark, and light-colored bark for Ohio Buckeye. This is a small to medium-sized tree usually. Short trunks, often crooked growth, low branches, drooping branches, really a poor form tree usually. You see it growing in moist coves, rich soil areas, riparian areas, bottomlands. It tends to prefer limestone-based soils, kind of like Chinkapin oak, but in a wetter environment. And it was reported that if you scratch the twigs or break the buds, it has an unpleasant odor. I did not take the time to verify that, so I cannot say that for sure. I'd be interested if anybody has smelled Ohio Buckeye and if you think it is smelly. Now, we talked about how thick Ohio Buckeye twigs are. So this Kentucky coffee tree, which is our next one, is the champion of thick buds or thick twigs. They has very, very stout twigs, but the buds are actually sunken down into the twigs and almost not visible. You can see that in this picture here. We've got a couple buds that are just barely little tiny raised points on the twigs themselves. It often is described as having the twigs look dead in coffee tree because you can't see the buds. It looks like an old dead twig, but they're very, very thick, huge, large leaf scars, U-shaped with large bundle scars in the leaf scars that are very noticeable. This is one that you can break open, look at the pith. The pith is going to be large and spongy and kind of light colored in coffee tree. That really jumps out, makes it noticeable. The twigs are very, very stout, like I said, usually a mottled in appearance, and many times they'll hold on to the rachis of the leaves well into the winter. So the leaflets will fall off, but the rachis will stay, and that seems to be common in coffee tree. Kentucky coffee tree has variable bark. Larger stems will have loose, shallow ridges. Smaller stems will have undulating, curled, thin plates or ridges. It has these long, kind of undulating, curvy ridges on it, or almost plates that kind of peel off of it. that really looks like nothing else. These curved interlacing looking to them jump out. On the smaller ones, you can kind of look under those peels or in the fissures, and it'll have kind of a pinkish color as well. But to me, it's that, like in this picture in the center, those plates that are thin and peel back and kind of undulate and curve really looks like nothing else. And that jumps out to me, and that's how I most easily identify Kentucky coffee tree. It's a medium-sized tree, usually twisted, thick branches, irregular canopy. This is one of those clonal trees which will come up from root suckers. So a lot of times you'll have big patches of it, and especially in disturbed areas, roadsides, old fields, forests where there might be kind of forest edges, where you have these big patches that all are connected underground by their root system. Another way to pick this one out is those heavy, short seed pods that are often retained on the female plants into the winter or laying on the ground below them. Much shorter, thicker than something like honey locust. This is a habitat generalist. I see it all over the place in terms of habitat. In general, it prefers moist, well-drained bottomlands, but I've seen it growing all the way into the uplands. So I would call it more of a generalist. Alrighty, let's talk about black gum, one of my favorite trees and one that's often misidentified because it kind of looks like everything else. But black gum has pointed, large buds with red scales. They can be somewhat hairy. The leaf scars are going to be a smiley face underneath of the buds, and it's going to have 3 bundle scars in it, and that really, to me, jumps out to you. You can see that on the bottom of the lower left. The twigs are moderately stout, are usually hairless. So even though the buds have some hairs on them, the twigs usually don't. And if you cut open a black gum and look at the pith is going to be chambered, kind of like black walnut was, but it's not hollow. So it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but it's a continuous pith. But you can see there's these partitions. There's one. I've highlighted them with arrows. You can see, so it has these partitions in an otherwise solid pith for black gum, and that will jump out to you. And that's a good way to verify if you think that's what you have. Black gum bark is dark gray, sometimes nearly black in color, thick, blocky, maybe broken ridges, may look a little bit like persimmon, something like that, or black oak even. The inner bark tends to have a yellow-brown coloration to it. But it's hard. It's kind of almost a nondescript bark, but the thick, blocky, broken ridges to me stand out. It's got a beautiful color to it, but it looks like several other species, and that makes it somewhat difficult to identify. This is a medium-sized tree. Branches are thick, often crooked. Usually a rounded or maybe irregular canopy, branches low to the ground. This one is another one of those habitat generalists with broad habitat suitability. It'll grow in wetlands, bottomlands, as long as it's well drained, all the way up into dry uplands. It does tend to prefer more acidic soils. It does better in those soils and prefers those. So you usually won't find this in areas where there's a lot of limestone. Alrighty, so the last tree we're going to cover today is Northern Catalpa. This one is the one that we're going to cover that has a whorled bud arrangement. So if you remember way back in day 1 on Monday, we talked about opposite and alternate, and then there was that weird third category where it has 3 or more leaves arising from the same point on the twig, or 3 or more leaf scars, or 3 or more buds. That's Catalpa. That's the one that falls into this category. With the caveat is that many times you will only see opposite. So you'll just have 2 buds at a time. But as long as you look around and pay attention, look at multiple twigs, you're usually going to find that whorled arrangement. As often or more often, you'll find opposite. The buds are small. They're usually sunken kind of at the top of the leaf scars and not very visible. The leaf scars are usually at these kind of swollen areas. And they're large and really rounded and sunken leaf scars. You see that on the picture on the lower left, really unusual looking, like a disc, and they're usually swollen in swollen areas of the twig, like this picture in the middle, that really stand out. The twigs are very stout, noticeable lenticels, and then those swollen areas with the whorled leaf arrangement really stand out like nothing else. They really look a lot different. The bark on catalpa is kind of nondescript. I don't use that a lot for identification. It kind of looks like anything else. You might mistake it for mulberry or several other trees. It's light brown and ridged and furrowed. It may have some slight twist as it goes up the trunk. But catalpa is a small to medium-sized tree usually, and to me, it's a short trunks. It's often has big branches closer to the ground, very, very limby. It's often very thick trunk at the base and gets thin. There's a lot of taper to it very quick, and it usually doesn't have a well-rounded canopy. It's usually kind of a broken canopy, so it looks like a broken down tree, limby, crooked. And to me, that really, from a distance, you can pick out catalpas just because they look so weird and crooked and limby compared to most other trees. You often can find their long bean pods. They're not really bean pods, but the long fruit pods hanging off of them even into the winter, or you can find the remnants of their flowers like you see here on the lower left, or you can see those thick twigs with the swollen leaf scars. It really jumps out to you even in the winter. It's easy to identify with those. This is a habitat generalist, shade intolerant. It loves fence rows, field edges, somewhat moist soils, but this is a classic kind of fence row tree. You'll find this growing at the edges or on fence rows more than you'll find it anywhere else, really.